So we recognize that everyone is coming from different places. I'm just admitting some people here. So for our land acknowledgement, we acknowledge that we are gathered in the territories of various Indigenous peoples, and we further recognize their stewardship of these lands in which we live, learn, work, and play. And I'm coming to you from the Kitchener-Waterloo area, and so I am a settler situated on the Haldimand Tract, which was promised to the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory after their assistance to the British during the American War of Independence. Vanessa, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I wanted to say hello this afternoon. I'm coming to you from Sudbury, which is the Anishinaabeg, Atikameksheng, and Wanapitei First Nations. Beautiful city up here in Sudbury. We are surrounded by lakes and trees and water, and it's a place where you know, nature really thrives. And I'm really proud to be teaching up here and sharing information about the Indigenous perspective. Megan?
And I am a settler educator living on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe as I live in Brantford, Ontario. And I also teach in a small town in Haldimand County called Cayuga Secondary School. So as a teacher, it would not make sense for me to not address Indigenous legal perspectives, considering the territory that I'm on. And I have to give a huge amount of credit to the Indigenous cultural mentors that have been offered through our Grand Area District School Board, which has been an invaluable source of great information. And also just pursuing that on my own. And we'll get into the whole aspect of treaties and recognizing your local treaties later. So in 2000, which is the year that my textbook was published, there's very little on Indigenous perspectives in the law. So a few years ago when I started teaching this, I really recognized the fact that there was a huge gap, and I really needed to work to fill that gap. So these are just some of the resources that I've been using over the last few years, and hopefully if there's other people that have other resources, we'd love to hear from you as well.
I would also like to add that in 2018, when the government did its updates to the history curriculum here in Ontario, OHSTA was there to help support that. And we further support action by members, school boards, and ministries of education to ensure that we are fully addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, especially number 62 and number 63. And as an association, OHSTA is committed to building respectful relationships that help us all work together.
Yeah. Okay, so who are we? OHSTA is the Ontario History and Social Sciences Teachers Association. We are a volunteer organization of practicing history and social sciences teachers in Ontario's elementary and secondary schools. We have been serving our members since 1978. And we would like to give thanks to the Ontario Teachers Federation for the use of their Zoom platform to help us stay connected. And if you're here with us this afternoon, we will make you aware of this again at the end, but OHSTA has a conference coming up in October 21st, and it will be an online conference again this year, but in partnership with the Manitoba Teachers Association, the Alberta Teachers Association as well. And we have the Honorable Murray Sinclair's son, Nigan Sinclair, as one of our keynote speakers. So just in case you are interested. Okay, so how to navigate Zoom. So to mute your mic, to eliminate any feedback, you just hit the mute button. And if you want to post any questions to the chat, there should be a chat feature. So I'm just on mine. I think if I scroll up or toggle over this, it'll come down. And on your screen, it should be towards the bottom. And now I'll just hand it over to the presenter.
Go ahead, Megan.
Okay, so are we going to do poll number 1 then, or do we want to do our little introduction still? Because we kind of
no, we can move on to poll number 1.
Okay, so we're going to go down to the next slide then. So we're going to put up a poll, and just, thinking about in terms of the new school year starting. Have you taught law before? So how many of you have taught law before?
Okay, so we have about 58% of participants who have taught both the grade 11 and grade 12, 10% each who have taught grade 11 and grade 12, and 23% who have never taught the courses before.
Okay, excellent. And then I think our next poll question will be the one that we see on the screen here.
Hold on.
Which is, should match, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what do you feel your biggest challenge will be this upcoming school year?
Okay, most people have voted, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So it looks like the majority, 37%, will find discussions around vaccinations and the law the most challenging, and then followed by content knowledge.
Did anyone in the group feel comfortable putting up in the chat what their other was? Because there were some people who had other as an option. Did anyone feel comfortable in sharing what their other concern was?
Vanessa and Megan, are you able to see the chat?
I don't see the chat right now, or I do see it, but
okay.
Oh, here we go. I just see one here. So this is coming from Charles, and then there's one from Stephen. So creating authentic opportunities to engage with those in the profession, plus getting guest speakers. Stephen mentions dealing with kids' mental health and getting back into a structured environment. Overcoming our own burnout. And Rob mentions that in Halton, they're doing every other week format. So we will see students 1 week and then on and 1 week off, which is what we're doing up here in the Rainbow District School Board. So I'm not sure if you did it that way last year in Halton, but we've actually had some really good feedback about it. So it's not as challenging as it seems. Supporting students with mental health challenges, engaging students, dealing with equality issues, and of course, split classes, especially with the quads in the 3-hour days. And some of you seem to be still doing, Maria mentioned, students being online and having kids in the class at the same time, so that hybrid model. And collaborative activities while keeping everybody apart is also very difficult. Okay, so hopefully we can address some of that today.
Yeah.
And the poll number 3.
So how confident are you with teaching about Indigenous perspectives and content? Okay, people have voted. So the majority say somewhat confident with 67%, not confident 23%, and 10% are confident.
Okay, so so hopefully some of the resources that we can provide you will give you a starting point. The whole idea behind this webinar is not to give you every single possible resource, but just to give you resources that both Vanessa and I have used that make us feel more confident in what we're teaching. Both Vanessa and I have been in contact with various Indigenous leaders and scholars and have been able to compile these resources. And it really is, and there's a lot of really good reciprocation that happens when you do reach out. So we're going to encourage you to reach out to people in your own community if that's readily available to you, because that's pretty much how I was able to develop my confidence anyways. I'm not 100%, but I'm getting way more confident than I was at the beginning of teaching the law classes.
I'm fairly fortunate we have an Aboriginal support worker in our building. So, you know, I spend a lot of lunch hours in her office sharing my ideas and, you know, going over how I plan to approach certain ideas and making sure that I have her perspective so that I can share that with my students. And I just noticed a chat piece coming up. Yeah, and if there's time, any tips, best practices on how to do this would be so appreciated. Yes, we're going to do breakout sessions at the end so we can share some of those best practices amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
So we'll move to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to start the first two pieces I'm going to share with you. Don't cover Indigenous perspectives. What these first two items are straight from OGen and CLU, and they are two interactive activities that students can use in the classroom and actually use the law and apply the law and practice going through the motions as opposed to just reading and answering questions. So the first one is called Access to Justice. It can be used in a grade 11 or a grade 12 classroom. And this is the PDF that you can download straight from OGen with all of the curriculum links are in there, how the game works, and how you can use it in your classroom. And the one thing that I would mention is there are 3 characters that students play. It's like a choose your own adventure, but with a civil legal perspective. So Jean has a family law issue. Jamie is dealing with employment issues, and Dallas has a housing problem. Now, Dallas is interesting in that Dallas has a disability is living on disability, excuse me, payments, and is also transgender. And Dallas is the character that I chose the first time I played this game. And I could feel Dallas's helplessness, even though it's like a video game. And so I always tell my students that when they're choosing a character, to be very mindful that Dallas's issues are really quite troubling. And some students may find it difficult to go through that character's choices and have to deal with the problems that they deal with. Can I get you to go back to the slide, Erin?
Sorry, 1 second.
Not a problem.
Why? I thought it was just on the other. Oh, here we go. Can you see that?
I just see, I click to exit full screen.
Oh, okay. There, maybe if I share my screen again.
So access to justice, I don't think it's brand new. I think it's been around for a couple of years, but I only used it for the first time last fall. I think they had it as a, like a sort of pen and paper sort of activity, and now it's available electronically. So if you go to the next slide.
Do you want to play the
all the links are going to be given to you at the end of and will be available on the OHSTA website as well. So there is this little video, this little training video that somebody could you can go through it. It shows you what the game is like to play it, and as you can see from the from this image, it's like a 1980s sort of extra pixelated video game, and the kids find it engaging to go through the material. So we'll go to the next slide. Oh, press play. Okay, so the next one, this activity, it's a set of web quests that you can do with your students, and there are, as you can see in the links here, there's the OGen Steps to Justice resources, and there's also a training video or a series of training videos on how to use these steps to justice. It was developed by CLU and OGen, and OGen did a presentation on this last year at the OHSTA conference. The web quest covers civil and criminal legal topics, and I'll get you just to click the OGen Steps to Justice. Erin, thanks. And what you'll see is all the different areas. So if you scroll down and a little more, okay, keep going. So it covers employment law, criminal law, family law. And so when you click on each of these, whatever topic you want your students to interact with and get a feel for, it's all right there. And there are work pages that you can use as well. All right, so we'll go back to the slideshow. And then of course there's that training video. Okay. Yeah, so this is, no, we're gonna go in the middle there. Right there, yeah. Oh, it keeps switching, that's okay. Okay, good, now we're where we need to be. So the steps to justice, this is just one of the pages. There's a whole section on debt and consumer rights. And so there are a series of case studies, and the students go through the case studies and try to determine what the best legal action for these people is in order to take care of their debt and consumer issues that they have. But again, there's employment law, criminal law, family law, all included in this Steps to Justice webpage. All right, we'll go to the next slide. This made the news. It's called Indigenous Canada, and it was developed by the University of Alberta. It's a massive online open course available through Coursera, and it's a free class that you can take. And I just forgot his name. Eugene Levy's son,
Daniel Levy,
had this out on Twitter. Yeah. Daniel Levy, thank you. Daniel Levy had this out on Twitter, I think either in April or May, sharing that he had taken this course. And so this summer I tackled it, and chapter 3 and 4 specifically cover areas of law, legal concepts and how Indigenous people see law and interact with law. And chapter 3 is about treaties. So there's lots of information there, not so much for your own students, but when you're building your own background knowledge, this is a great place to go. Next slide. So We Will Stand Up is a documentary. When I'm talking about, I should talk about Indigenous legal perspectives. So things like reconciliation as opposed to retribution, justice circles. Does that help answer that question that just came up? I hope. Okay. We Will Stand Up is a documentary that looks at the death of Colton Bushy and the subsequent trial and how the media portrayed that. It was created by an Indigenous filmmaker, and there is also a teacher's guide available. So you can use this documentary in a law classroom, you could use it in a history classroom, you could use it in a world studies classroom, you could probably even adapt it to use in an English classroom. Just a moment. There is some content in there that is very sensitive. And so again, you'll want to make sure that your students are prepared for that. And I see that Jody is here. I'm hoping, Jody, that I'm discussing that correctly, that Canadian law in regards to how Indigenous people interact with that. And Megan can further explain that. All right, so those are the 4 items that I had, and we'll move on to Megan.
Okay, so I wanted to sort of tackle that question with what do we mean by Indigenous law? So there's a couple of things that we have to talk about there. And as a settler, sometimes you might feel uncomfortable approaching this. But basically, when I'm talking about it in terms of a law class, is how do Canadian or colonial laws impact Indigenous people? Or how do they interact with the pre-existing laws the laws in existing Canada? And also, how do treaties with colonial powers sort of create another foundation of Canadian law that's kind of been pushed to the side? And one aspect of that I think is really important in both grade 11 and grade 12 is understanding exactly what's going on with the Indian Act, right? And a lot of people make reference to this very, very sort of important act in Canadian history, and not recognizing that there is a very long history of this. And now that we have all of these reactions to the John A. Macdonald statutes, et cetera, we recognize that this is a very current and contemporary issue, not just a historic one. So this podcast is one that I used last year with my grade 12 law class. And it's really, really significant because it is forming the basis of a lot of protests of both Indigenous groups and allies to Indigenous groups. There's several different books that have come out recently, one of which that I read this summer is 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. Right. So there is a podcast that I use, and my grade 12s absolutely loved it. And this particular podcast is done by 2 Indigenous presenters. And they have a whole series called The Secret Life of Canada. And this one here deals explicitly with the Indian Act and the history of the Indian Act and how residential schools sort of fit into that. And this is an excellent resource. And the reason why I've chosen this one is it does cover both grade 11 and grade 12 expectations. So B4.4, describe how legislation in recent landmark cases relating to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples have influenced the circumstances of Aboriginal people and the interpretation of Aboriginal rights in Canada. Also in grade 12, C21, analyze the impact, both positive and negative, of landmark legislation on development of human rights law in Canada. So one of the things that I had my grade 12s do is we did a legal history timeline, like the Magna Carta and all that kind of stuff. And then I had them do a separate timeline just dealing with the rights of Indigenous peoples in what is now known as Canada. And then they did like a positive, negative sort of thing. And then at the end, they were like, well, how do we move forward with settlers and Indigenous people? So that was a real eye opener for my students. It was really effective. And we'll just go to the next, oh no, that slide's right. No, go back, sorry, because my slide. Okay. So if you click on the picture on the left-hand side, you should be able to go into there. So what's great about this is that this podcast, there is a PowerPoint that they have designed so that you can teach through the podcast. So instead of just assigning the podcast, you can actually teach through the podcast. I actually downloaded the entire master folder directly to our Google Drive. So when you open that, it has PDF documents that have been developed by teachers across Ontario in consultation with Indigenous groups about, you know, here is what the Indian Act says, here's how it impacts people. You can pull things out directly. You know, you can do one lesson on, just say, for example, like a little, and it goes through all of that, right? And so you can really pull parts of the podcast out. You can do just one section of it. You can talk about the concept of you know, the status, the concept of status, and taking a look at that. The activities are all separated, and you can amend those as well. The one that I'm going to be using with my civics class, for example, is this one here on stereotypes. And I think that's a good introduction for the students in grade 10 civics, because a lot of this is coming up. But then you can also tweak and you can use any or all of the lessons and modify them because they're docx files. So you can take questions out, you can put questions in, and they're all in there as well. So I'm just going to check the chat. I see. So this is a great starting point for people who are perhaps not knowing exactly what the Indian Act says, or how changes to the Indian Act have been, you know, made. For example, Mary 2 acts early didn't challenge the Indian Act itself. She challenged the gender inequality within the Indian Act. So that's an interesting perspective to use as well. So that particular, and if you click on the picture to the right, which is the picture of the residential school, it's excellent. It just gives you, if you scroll down, it gives you the overview of the entire podcast, and you keep going down, and then there is like a little overview of like what you're going to hear in the episode, and then there's a whole bunch of references that were used to compile and create this episode as well. So this is a really great thing to start with when you're dealing with the Indian Act, because a lot of people haven't read the Indian Act, and it's important to sort of understand how to access it. One of the things that one of my students came up with at the end of their presentation last year was like, let's just change the name of the act to start with, and then let's move forward from there. So at the end of this, what I'll do is I'll put up my email, my board email, and then I can send that that activity that I did where my students co-constructed their own Indigenous perspectives timeline. Okay, the next slide. Okay, we'll take a look at that in 1 second. So this is an interesting one as well. I did this with my grade 11s 2 years ago. I would not do it again with grade 11s. The issue of the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls is not just historic. I start with the Helen Betty Osborne case, and then I move forward from that. We talk about the inquiry. Unfortunately, I didn't gauge my audience properly, and there were a couple of my students in that class who were directly impacted by this topic, and I had to sort of modify this. But the idea here was that after we talked about the Indian Act, we talked about the residential schools, that we talked about this, what we call the systemic racism within the legal system that's already there, and how this issue of missing murdered Indigenous women was not just a historic issue, but also a contemporary one. And because of that, there was a huge investigation. And this directly speaks to the curriculum expectation, where it talks about in grade 11, a legal perspective of how well the rights of various parties are protected in the criminal justice system. So you're looking at gender and you're looking at race here. You're also assessing from a legal perspective how well the rights of various parties are protected. Oh, I already have that twice there. But also in grade 12, assess the relative effectiveness of various legal or political means used by individuals and groups to advocate for legal reform. Has the position of, you know, women who are Indigenous in the legal system, has it changed as a result of this inquiry? How is it likely to change, etc.? But be very, very careful, because the interactive, which is on the next slide. Okay, so CBC News did an interactive where you can actually go through and you can click on open cases. These are open cases. Some of them are cold cases of women in Canada who were murdered or are missing, and who are Indigenous. So this is where you really have to know your students. And some of them are very curious about this, but then because of where I live, which is very close to Six Nations territory on the Grand River, there were a couple of my students in the class who were very emotional because they had aunts and they had, you know, sisters or close friends who were part of this group of people. And it was a very emotional and traumatic experience for them, unfortunately. However, it also did at the same time highlight to my non-Indigenous students in the class that this is actually a thing that affects people throughout the entire country. And this is why we have these. So it was like a really roller coaster of emotion. It was a valuable exercise, but not one that I would approach in the same way. What I ended up having them doing was a public service announcement. How do we bring awareness to this situation? And I had them do what we call a raft, where they do the role, and then they have the, you know, the action, et cetera, et cetera. So they actually created their own public service announcements about this. And a lot of kids did newscasts, etc. And it was actually really well done. The actual inquiry itself, if you click on the logo for the National Inquiry into the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls, it does the full report. So these are all the recommendations. This is similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they make these recommendations for how do we fix this. They've actually argued that this is an example of, you know, cultural genocide. And there is systemic injustice here, and it's all done through this group. So you want to make sure that. Okay, so I'm going to get through this one source, and then Jody, I'm going to come back to the questions. Okay, so it's important to just this is a very raw topic. It's very relevant. It's very current. And it's quite disturbing. So when I showed my students the documentary on the Helen Betty Osborne, there's also a graphic novel about the death of Helen Betty Osborne, who sort of triggered this whole entire missing, murdered Indigenous women movement. It just is very raw. So I would approach it maybe a little differently, or I actually have now reserved this for my grade 12 class, just because they're just that little bit more mature. So I'm just going to address the questions in the chat right now. Okay.
I think they're talking about the like labor camps that are in Indigenous territory.
No, I haven't explored that specifically. Like, this is just one area that I've looked at, and again, I'm still learning myself. So are we talking like in BC, in areas like Wet'suwet'en and those types of places?
Yes.
Okay, so I've never actually thought about the intersection of those two topics together. It's never crossed my mind. So that that's an amazing intersection right there. And I think that would be a really interesting way to approach this. Like, this is all about intersectionality, and this is just, there's missing murdered Indigenous women, but then we also have like the environmental impact of the pipelines and the protests and things like that. So that is an interesting perspective. Okay. All right. And then I think I've also, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, and this is the idea about trauma-informed approaches. So I had a colleague of mine who's now, she's with OHSTA, and she always came in, I'm not sure, has anyone in the audience ever done the blanket exercise before? Where you have, we had these Indigenous consultants in our school board, Grand Erie District School Board, who came in and they did this activity where they put all these blankets all over the ground in the classroom, and then every student had a role to play. And basically it's a simulation of what happens with colonization, and they come in. And at the very end, my colleague Sabrina Sawyer, who's now with OHSTA, she sat down and she explained to students how to, if you wanted to react to something. And she did a talking circle. She did it one way, because she was Mohawk, so she did it one way, and then the other way was for somebody else who was in the room, and it gave people an opportunity to either say something or to not say something. And for my students, they'd never been in an environment where they actually had the opportunity to speak without being interrupted, because they were able to hold the wampum. So if you have opportunities to connect with your Indigenous consultants and you mention the blanket exercise, that might be a good way to deal with some of that trauma that some of the kids are feeling. And also just consulting with those Indigenous consultants in your board. But I would highly recommend, if you are very new to approaching the topic about reconciliation, that you ask your Indigenous consultants in your board to do the blanket exercise, which is a simulation where they come in and they read little roles about what's happening with the colonization of Indigenous people. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Okay, is that the next slide? Yeah. Okay, so this is a big one for me in my grade 12 class, because I came across an article a few years ago, and it uses this phrase, we're all treaty people. And I found a lot of times when I was teaching as a settler, at the very beginning of my teaching career, I would say us, them, that kind of thing. I did the othering language that I got rid of, but I found that my students were still using that language, that there's those people and then there's these people and we're all separate. And this article that I came across is really, really important. So understanding treaty law is understanding Indigenous perspectives, because the entire foundation of Indigenous settler relationships is built on these treaties. And it's really, really significant for Indigenous peoples, considering some of the contemporary issues that are happening today. So on the left is my history of treaties. So if you're teaching grade 11, grade 12 law, you should be able to explain a wampum. And a wampum is a form, it's a non-textual, basically, artifact. It's a beaded belt made of quahog shells, usually white and purple. And the pattern on that lays out sort of a relationship between two individuals, 3 individuals, 4 individuals, 5 individuals, or groups. We did have one at the very beginning. Can we just scroll back to, I apologize. Can we go back to section 2, slide 2? What time are we at? 4:39, okay. So slide 2 is at the very bottom. We have a wampum there. Just by a little, like, put your hands up if you recognize that wampum specifically, or if you could tell me which wampum that is. Yes, that is the 2-row wampum. And that was a agreement, 1613, that was made between the Haudenosaunee and Dutch settlers. And the idea was that they would occupy the same river, and that they would share the river, but that they would not interfere with each other, that they were basically brothers sailing along, one in a canoe and one in a sailboat, and that they would share the river and respect each other's boundaries, customs, traditions, etc. And this is essentially the foundation of where I am, which is at the Haldimand Tract, that the Haudenosaunee are the dominant Indigenous group in this particular part of Ontario. And this underlies pretty much every aspect of their discussion around law. Everything comes back to this idea of the two-row, that we are separate and equal, and that we are brothers. And it was agreed that they were going to be brothers. And all of that sort of unraveled as various colonial governments came in. So we'll just go back to that slide that I had on the treaties, which was slide 20. And I'll be done very shortly because I tend to ramble. I know, Vanessa. Okay. So understanding what a wampum is really key, and recognizing, and I think this is important as well, is as teachers, we have to recognize and respect a non-text document or a non-text artifact as much as we respect, say, a written document. I think we get very sort of like the Magna Carta, and it's written in their signatures. Whereas in Indigenous culture, the wampum is a symbol of a treaty, an agreement, an alliance, etc. And they were used right up until the First World War. Right? Exactly. So Jody's just mentioning that a wampum is a form of a contract, which is one section of the grade 11 course and another section within the grade 12 course. And within Canada, we have various treaties in Ontario with the numbered treaties, but also recognize the importance of treaties. And then now when we look at famous laws, where people are using these treaties and saying that the treaties have not been upheld, there's examples there. I'm not going to go through each of them. The Calder case, the Sparrow test, the Desautel case that came out last year, Grassy Narrows, Haldimand Tract. All these news articles that we're seeing in the paper recently are dealing with this issue around treaties not being honored. It's really, really important for us to recognize that a treaty is not just an agreement between Canada and other countries. It's an agreement between nations. And nations within Canada, those First Nations, see themselves as separate and sovereign nations. So there's that idea too. Like you think about sovereignty and you think about international relations, and these First Nations literally in the First World War had allied themselves with the British, not because they were, in Canada, but because they were separate allies. They actually fought as separate allies, not as part of the British forces, for example. And then this sort of creates the framework. And now we have treaty law in Canada that's framing all these things. We also have the calls to action. So one of the things that you're doing when you're starting to explore these resources is you're honoring those calls to action, which is part of the reconciliation piece. And then also UNDRIP, which has just been passed by the Senate, which is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So all of that's covered. They're all in there. They're all in there. Okay, next slide, sorry. And I'm going to be quick. Is the numbered treaties. All these maps are available. I've put links to the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada where it talks about treaties and it talks about truth and reconciliation. Next slide. Okay, so the overview of treaties, like Vanessa said before, trick or treaty is chapter 3 in that MOOC. Also, there's a link here. You don't have to click on it right now. It's the treaties with Indigenous people in Canada. A very, very great video. It's about 5 minutes that explains very quickly what a treaty is and what the numbered treaties mean and all that kind of stuff. And also, I think it's very important for teachers to recognize where they are geographically. In my own classroom, I talk about the 2-row all the time. I talk about the dish with 1 spoon, and I talk about the Haldimand Treaty a lot, to the point where the kids all actually, and so I find when you start using these treaties and you refer to these treaties constantly, they get more comfortable with it. And for the grade 12s, there's an article there. Again, I've given the link called We Are All Treaty People, which is like a change in mindset. It's not just like the Indigenous people and the rest of Canada. It's like we're all subject to these treaties, and recognizing that, we were not the ones that wrote the treaties, but we are all subject to these treaties, and they are the basis of a lot of conflict that's happening right now. So in a nutshell, those are some resources that I've used very successfully. I've done seminars with students. I've done rafts. I've done timelines, co-constructed timelines. And again, I'll pop my name, my email up into the chat, and then people can just email me for specific resources.
Yeah, I also have some lessons similar to Megan's. I also have a lesson around UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. But again, we're trying to squeeze everything in today, and we'll give you our email addresses, and we're totally willing to support anyone who needs assistance. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Jody, who's here today. Your input has been really helpful. All right, next slide. All right, so we're going to put people into some breakout rooms where you guys can have an opportunity to talk to each other about what strategies you could use to deliver some of this content, and what do you feel would be appropriate for the content, and ultimately, you know, make some connections with other teachers and talk about best practices. So whenever you're ready, Erin, you can make about 6 or 7. With group 2. Group 2, is there somebody who would like to share maybe your a takeaway or something that you guys want to do moving forward?
I'm not sure that we had like real takeaways moving forward. We were just sort of getting in there and being like, oh, have you heard about this? What about this one? Oh yeah, that's a great one. Thanks for that. So yeah, it wasn't really enough time to get like fully stuck into it, but it was just nice to get a few more ideas of places to go for, you know, more information or engaging materials, right? Because, you know, there's a lot out there and new content being created all the time. So it was just really nice to connect in that way.
Good. All right, group 3, anything you'd like to share?
We talked quite a bit about oftentimes when you're given the course to teach, you're just given that textbook. And we were talking about the absolute lack of cohesive resources that are like centralized to help these people. So the Canadian International Law Text and the All About Law Text, those grade 11, grade 12 textbooks are just completely devoid of any authentic or relevant material related to teaching Indigenous content. So we were talking about like just making, like having a way for people to access that information. And the other thing too, is there's so much out there and it is such a bit of a minefield. You have to be aware of where you're getting your information from and who's vetted it and all these types of things. So, and then the other concept that we brought up is that I actually teach about treaty law when I talk about international law, is that these, and Danielle and I were talking about how these treaties are in fact contracts between nations, sovereign nations. So I actually talk more about treaties at the end of my grade 12 course, where we talk about nationhood and sovereignty. And that's the other thing too that Danielle's just brought up, is that I'm in an area where Six Nations is predominant. But up in Sudbury, it's a totally different group of a cultural group, a linguistic group, right?
Yeah, so mostly Anishinaabe here, but also Nehiawa as well.
So how do we, and that's the thing, as teachers, we have like this Canadian legal system, but then we have all these individual treaties, individual cultural groups, individual challenges for every individual Indigenous group. So it's difficult as a teacher. I think maybe localizing it to your area is probably the best way to go, I would imagine. It's what's worked for me anyways.
Okay. Group 5 and 6, anyone want to share? I think we've got everybody. again, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Did anybody have questions or next steps?
So,
yeah, so go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, as the chat, so is there a way for us to take a copy of the chat?
Yes.
Can we? Okay. Because what I'd like to do with Vanessa and Aaron at some point in the next little while is go through those questions and see if we can attach specific resources to those questions. And then in the actual website, then we can email people the link to that and they can access that.
Yeah. So
okay?
the slideshow that we have here for you today will be posted on the OHSTA website with all of the links added and all hyperlinked in there, along with a video of today's discussion so that you can go back, or if you know somebody who missed out on that, then you'll have